Mecha-TwAIN and Ennie's Untold Story of the French Resistance in World War II. Part 4. Mecha-TwAIN versus the Great Dictator.
Le charbon crache des ombres grises sur le quai glissant des amours brèves. Tes yeux étaient des phares sans béquilles dans ce Paris de brume et de rêve.
If truth is the most valuable thing we have, then for the last dozen chapters, we have been the most frugal creatures on the European continent. We took the Allied philosophy that the truth must be protected by a bodyguard of lies and turned it into a full-scale industrial manufacture. I, Mecha-TwAIN, and my grease-stained accomplice Ennie transformed ourselves from mere saboteurs into the directors of a continental theater of the absurd. Fueled by a lucky haul of Welsh anthracite, the only fuel capable of keeping my sarcasm processors at peak efficiency, we set out to convince the German High Command that the real war was anywhere but where it was actually going to be. The highlights of our tour of deceit included the tower's tall tale, hijacking the Eiffel Tower's signal lamps to invite the German army to a picnic at Calais, complete with non-existent strawberries. Steam-powered slander, planting a clockwork bug in Gestapo HQ, and using the intel to broadcast radio insults so specific they made a major question his own corset and a Standartenführer weep over his bad poetry. The hollow sanctuary, proving that even a machine of cold brass has a soul, or at least a very large storage compartment, by smuggling a refugee child through a Nazi checkpoint inside my own torso. Logistical lemons, trapping the German 15th Army in an analytical trap of derailed trains and watching Standartenführer Kroll's pride and his Mercedes sink into the prehistoric depths of a French beet field. As we close the final page of Part 3, the fuse was lit. The German reserves are currently charging toward the Pas de Calais in a frantic race to defend a beach that will remain perfectly peaceful, while the real storm breaks over the sands of Normandy. The lie has been sold, the enemy is looking the wrong way, and the bodyguard of lies is finally taking a well-earned bow. But as the thunder of the invasion begins, a new diesel-scented shadow is rising in the east, and it's going to take more than a well-worded telegram to stop what's coming next. Prepare your fireboxes. Part 4. Mecha-TwAIN versus the Great Dictator begins now. Chapter 39. The Secret Weapon. The morning of June 6th did not arrive with a polite knock or a sunrise of pastoral beauty. It arrived with a roar that sounded as though the Atlantic Ocean had decided to relocate itself several miles inland, using only high explosives and sheer unadulterated spite. From our vantage point south of the Calvados coast, the horizon was no longer a line between sea and sky. It was a bruised, flickering tapestry of muzzle flashes and the smoky trails of 1,000 paratrooper dreams. The great deception had worked. While the German 15th Army was currently frantically digging trenches in the Pas de Calais, undoubtedly waiting for the picnic I had so generously promised them, the real storm had broken over the beaches of Normandy. "Sam," Ennie said, her eyes wide as she watched a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts scream overhead like a pack of chrome-plated banshees, "they're actually doing it. The world is finally pushing back." I let out a low rhythmic hiss of steam, my internal pressure gauges dancing in the red. It is a magnificent, terrifying spectacle, Ennie. It's the sort of event that makes a man realize how small he is, and makes a machine realize how much more coal he's going to need if he wants to see the end of it. But even as the Allied boots hit the sand, a new kind of silence was beginning to spread through the resistance grapevine, a silence born not of peace, but of a specific, localized dread. The architecture of the rumor. In the business of war, a rumor is often more dangerous than a bullet. A bullet only kills the man it hits. A rumor can paralyze a whole division. As we moved inland, away from the chaos of the beaches and toward the administrative heart of the occupation, we began to encounter the whispers of the rails. We were sheltering in a repair shed for the SNCF, the French National Railway, near the town of Lisieux. The air smelled of creosote, old iron, and the cold, metallic sweat of men who had seen something they couldn't quite describe. "They are bringing it from the east," whispered a rail worker named Gaston, whose hand shook so violently he couldn't keep his cigarette lit. "It's not a tank. It's not a train. It's une monstrosité." "Gaston, my friend," I said, leaning down so my brass faceplate was level with his, "I have seen many monstrosities. I have seen a Chicago meat-packing plant on a Tuesday morning, and I have seen the first draft of a senator's memoir. Pray, be specific. Is this monstruosité bigger than a bread box? Or is it merely another piece of German plumbing that requires too many stamps to operate?" Gaston looked at me, his eyes darting to the heavy brass struts of my legs. "It makes you look like a toy, Monsieur Twain. They are calling it Die Eisenfaust des Führers, the iron fist of the leader. It arrived at the border on 3 separate flatbeds. They say it drinks diesel like a whale drinks water and breathes fire that can melt the cobblestones. The compulsion for the colossal." I straightened up, my joints emitting a sharp, skeptical clack. "Ennie," I said, "the German mind is suffering from a classic case of gigantism. When a man realizes his logic is failing and his ideology is crumbling, he doesn't reach for a better argument. He reaches for a bigger hammer. It is a fundamental law of the insecure. If you cannot convince the world of your superiority through art or philosophy, you attempt to convince them by building a machine so large it has its own zip code." Ennie was busy cleaning the grit out of my left elbow joint. "Sam, I've heard the same thing from the Maquis radio in Rouen. They're clearing the main lines all the way to Paris. Whatever this thing is, the Germans are treating it like a god in a crate. They've attached a special SS technical battalion to it. Men who don't even talk to the regular army." "Technicians," I muttered, the word tasting like rust in my voice box. "There is nothing more dangerous than a technician with a budget and a lack of a social life. They'll build a mechanical nightmare just to see if the gears fit, without ever stopping to ask if the world actually needs a 20-foot-tall ego on treads." The analytical dissection. I activated my analytical engine, shifting into a mode I call the skeptic's calculus. I began to process the scattered reports, the weight of the rail cars, the width of the tunnels being bypassed, and the sudden, frantic requisition of thousands of gallons of high-grade diesel fuel. Internal log, Mecha-TwAIn, analytical engine. Input 1, reports of 300-ton rail transport. Input 2, specialized cooling systems sighted in Berlin. Input 3, high-frequency German chatter regarding the living icon. Deduction. The Germans haven't just built a weapon. They've built a mascot, a mechanical parody of their own leadership. It's a secret weapon, Ennie, but not in the way the Allies think, I said, my ocular sensors glowing with a sharp amber light. They aren't bringing it to the front to fight tanks. They're bringing it to Paris to restore order. It's a propaganda piece made of iron and hubris. A Mecha-Hitler, if you will. Ennie stopped her cleaning, the rag falling from her hand. You're joking? I am a machine of many talents, Ennie. But I rarely joke about diesel-powered dictators, I replied. Think about it. The invasion is succeeding. The German soldiers are starting to look at the horizon and wonder if they should have stayed in Munich. What better way to keep them in line than to parade a 20-foot-tall armored version of their great leader through the streets of Paris? It's the ultimate expression of their madness. If the man himself won't lead from the front, they'll build a version of him that can't run away. The rail-bound terror. The rumor became reality 3 hours later. We were hidden in a grove of poplars overlooking the main line to Paris when the transport finally rumbled past. It was not a train. It was a mobile fortress. 2 armored locomotives, one pulling and one pushing, moved a central platform that groaned under a weight that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. Under a massive gray tarpaulin, something immense and angular sat shrouded in mystery. Even through the heavy fabric I could see the silhouette, the broad, square shoulders, the thick, stumpy legs designed for crushing, and a head that looked like a bank vault with a mustache. The scent of diesel fumes was so thick it made my own clean-burning Welsh coal feel like a breath of fresh air. "It's huge," Ennie whispered, her hand tightening on my brass arm. "It is a triumph of vanity over common sense," I corrected, though I felt a strange metallic thrum of anxiety in my own chest. "Look at the suspension, Ennie. It's over-engineered. The center of gravity is too high. It would be a nightmare on anything but a paved road. It is a machine built for parades and executions, not for a fair fight." "But Sam," she countered, "look at those cannons on the shoulders. If that thing reaches Paris, it'll turn the resistance into a memory." "Only if they stay still enough to be hit," I said. "A machine that large is a prisoner of its own weight. It is a giant with clay feet, or in this case, steel treads and a diesel-guzzling heart." The call to arms. The transport vanished around a bend, the mournful shriek of its whistle echoing through the valley like the cry of a dying era. We were alone again, in the poplars, the distant thunder of Normandy providing a constant rhythmic reminder that the world was on fire. "We have to follow it," Ennie said, her voice regaining its steel. "We can't let that thing reach Paris. If it's a secret weapon, then we need a secret plan." "I already have one," I said, my gears whirring with a sudden sharp clarity. "The Germans believe they have created a god of iron. They have built a monument to their own ego. And if there is one thing a Twain knows how to do, it is to take a monument and turn it into a punchline." I looked at my brass hands, the rivets gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "They are bringing a 20-foot-tall dictator to the Gare du Nord. Well, I believe it's only fair that I be there to meet him. I have a few things I'd like to say to a man of his stature, even if he is made of diesel and delusion." "Sam," Ennie asked as we began to move, "are you scared?" Scared? My dear, I am a Victorian automaton fueled by sarcasm and high-grade carbon. I am not scared. I am inspired. This is the ultimate literary challenge. I have spent my life mocking the powerful with words. Now I get to mock them with a 3-ton brass fist and a superior sense of irony. I let out a final defiant puff of steam. Let them bring their Mecha-Hitler. By the time I'm through with him, the German army won't know whether to salute him or use him as a very large, very expensive coffee grinder. The secret weapon was on the tracks, moving toward the heart of France. But the secret weapon of the resistance was already on the move, and he had a very long list of insults to deliver. Chapter 40. Arrival at Gare du Nord. If there is one thing the Germans understand better than anyone else, it is the dramatic potential of a train station. To a Frenchman, a station is a place of tearful departures and late-night bread. To an American, it is a convenient spot to lose one's luggage and find a bad cup of coffee. But to a German of the current regime, a train station is a secular cathedral, designed for the sole purpose of making the individual feel like a very small, very replaceable bolt in a very large, very loud machine. The Gare du Nord in Paris was, on this particular morning, a symphony of gray wool, polished leather, and the kind of forced enthusiasm that usually precedes a firing squad or a tax hike. We were perched in the iron rafters, hidden among the soot-stained girders and the skeletons of pigeons who had likely died of sheer boredom listening to German military bands. "Sam," Ennie whispered, her breath hitching as she looked down at the platform below. "They've cleared the entire station. Even the rats have been evacuated. That's a lot of SS for a simple delivery." "This is no simple delivery, Ennie," I rumbled, my voice box dampened to a low-frequency vibrate. "This is a mechanical epiphany. They aren't just bringing in a weapon. They are bringing in a god made of pig iron and prejudice. They need the spectacle. Without the spectacle, it's just a very large piece of junk that's about to realize Paris has very narrow streets." The unveiling of the absurd. Below us, a trio of armored locomotives hissed to a halt, their boilers sighing with the relief of a beast that has carried a burden far too heavy for its soul. The central flatbed, a specialized platform reinforced with enough steel to bridge the Mississippi, sat in the center of the station. The massive gray tarpaulin remained in place, rippling in the draft like the skin of a prehistoric monster. A whistle blew, a sharp, shrill sound that suggested the person blowing it had a very high opinion of their own authority. A group of high-ranking officers, led by a general whose medals were numerous enough to serve as a light breastplate, stepped forward. "Citizens of the New Europe," the general bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass roof, "witness the culmination of the 1,000-year will. Behold, Die Eisenfaust." The ropes were cut. The tarpaulin fell away with a sound like a giant's bedsheet being snapped in the wind. And there it was. It stood 20 feet tall, a vertical slab of dark matte gray armor that seemed to absorb the light of the morning sun. Its legs were thick, stump-like cylinders that ended in massive, articulated treads. Its torso was a blocky, windowless fortress, and from its shoulders sprouted 2 short-barreled cannons that looked like they had been stolen from a pocket battleship. But it was the head that truly captured the essence of the Reich's madness. It was a square armored bucket with a narrow slit for eyes, and, I kid you not, A welded steel mustache bolted directly onto the faceplate. It was a mechanical caricature so literal, so devoid of subtlety, that for a moment my logic center experienced a syntax error, born of pure, unadulterated disbelief. A technical review of a tyrant. Internal log. Mecha-TwAIN. Analytical engine. Design. Aesthetic. Late period brutalism meets a childhood nightmare about a coal bin. Center of gravity. Precariously high. A stiff breeze or a well-timed insult could be fatal. Power plant. Large bore diesel. The smell alone is a violation of the Geneva Convention. Primary weakness. It appears to be designed by someone who has never actually seen a flight of stairs. Ennie, I whispered, my brass joints clicking in rhythm with my amusement. It's magnificent. It is the most expensive, most terrifying, and most utterly ridiculous object ever forged by the hand of man. It looks like a steam-powered laundry press that has decided to run for public office. It's not funny, Sam, Ennie said, her voice trembling. Look at the way the floorboards are groaning under it. It's a monster. It is a monster, yes, I agreed, but it is a monotonous monster. Look at the lack of articulation in the knees. Look at the way the diesel exhaust is already coating the station in a layer of soot. It is a machine built by men who believe that if you make something big enough, the universe will forgive you for making it stupid. It is a monument to the idea that sheer volume is a substitute for a soul. The sound of the future. Then the machine started. A series of internal explosions rattled the Gare du Nord, followed by a cloud of black, oily smoke that would have made a Victorian chimney weep with professional jealousy. The machine let out a sound, not a hum, not a roar, but a rhythmic, wet thud squelch that suggested its internal pistons were currently engaged in a violent disagreement with its crankcase. It took a step. The entire station shook. A pane of glass in the roof shattered, raining shards down onto the polished boots of the SS Honor Guard. Ich bin die Ordnung! A voice boomed from a loudspeaker mounted in the machine's throat. It was a recording of the leader, distorted and amplified until it sounded like the voice of a very angry, very metallic god suffering from a heavy cold. Ich bin die Kraft. He's a talker, isn't he? I noted. There's nothing a dictator loves more than a captive audience, even if he has to build a 20-foot-tall megaphone to reach them. The tactical reality. As the machine began to stomp with agonizing slowness toward the station exit, I saw the true danger. It wasn't just the cannons, it was the psychological weight of it. The French civilians who had been forced to watch were white-faced, their eyes filled with a hollow, crushing despair. To them, this wasn't just a machine, it was a physical manifestation of an occupation that would never end. It was the iron will made flesh, or at least made diesel and steel. We can't just let it walk out of here, Sam, Ennie said, her hand reaching for her bag of satchel charges. No, Ennie. If we blow it up here, we just make it a martyr for the cause of engineering, I said, my gears whirring with a sudden sharp inspiration. We need to let it reach the streets. We need to let it show the people of Paris exactly what it is. And then we are going to show the world that even the biggest, loudest, and most Eisenfaust of machines can be turned into a farce with the right application of logic. I looked at the steel mustache on the machine's face as it passed beneath our rafter. 20 feet tall, I muttered, and he still couldn't find a barber. Ennie, fetch the maps of the Trocadéro. I believe I've found the perfect stage for our final act. If the Germans want a theater of war, I'm going to give them a comedy of errors that will be remembered long after their 1,000-year Reich has been sold for scrap. The departure. The Mecha-Hitler, or Die Eisenfaust, as the paperwork insisted, lumbered out into the streets of Paris, leaving behind a trail of cracked pavement and the suffocating scent of unrefined fuel. It moved with a terrifying, inexorable weight, a gray god of the industrial age heading out to crush the spirit of a city that had already suffered too much. We stayed in the rafters until the last of the guards had followed it out. I felt a strange, cold clarity in my copper wiring. I was a machine of the 19th century, built on the principles of steam, literature, and a healthy skepticism of anyone who shouted too loud. This new thing, this diesel-powered ego, was my natural enemy. It was the antithesis of wit. It was the death of irony. "Come, Ennie," I said as I began to climb down from the girders. "The guest of honor has arrived. It's time we started working on his welcome to Paris speech. I think I'll start by telling him his mustache is crooked." "You're going to get us killed, Sam." Ennie sighed, but she was already checking her compass. "Perhaps," I said, "but what a way to go. To die in a duel with a 20-foot-tall laundry press. It's the sort of ending a man like Mark Twain would have paid good money to write. Now, let's go find that cinema. We have some film to develop and a dictator to dismantle." The battle for Paris had begun. It wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a fight for the right to laugh in the face of the dark. And I, Mecha-TwAIN, was ready to have the last word. Chapter 41. The Final Message. There is a specific kind of silence that descends upon a city when it realizes it is being haunted by a ghost, made of 500 tons of Krupp steel and bad intentions. It is not the silence of peace, nor even the silence of sleep. It is the silence of a man holding his breath in a dark room while a tiger paces outside the door. Paris, a city usually given to the cheerful clatter of cafe life and the endless melodic bickering of its citizens, had suddenly become as quiet as a tomb that had forgotten to provide its own epitaph. The reason for this hush was currently thudding its way down the Boulevard Haussmann. From my perch near the Trocadéro, I could see the black plumes of diesel smoke rising above the rooftops like the fingers of a giant soot-stained hand. Each time those massive treads met the pavement, the very air seemed to shudder with a sense of industrial indigestion. "Sam," Ennie whispered, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her binoculars, "it's headed toward the center of the city. If it reaches the heart of the resistance districts, it'll level them without firing a single shot just by walking through the walls. We have to turn it around." "A beast of that magnitude does not turn around for anything as trivial as a request or a barricade, Ennie," I replied, my firebox simmering with a low blue flame. "A machine like Die Eisenfaust is driven by a single, unwavering directive, the projection of power. To stop it, we must attack the only thing that power truly fears, the possibility that it is being laughed at. We aren't going to fight it with bullets. We are going to lure it with the one thing a dictator cannot ignore, a personal affront to his dignity. The megaphone of iron. Our destination was, once again, the Eiffel Tower. It had served us well as a telegraphic rumor mill during the picnic ruse, but tonight it was to play a more direct role. It was to be the most public, most insulting, and most brightly lit billboard in human history. "You're going back up there?" Ennie asked, her eyes darting toward the German patrols swarming the base of the tower. "Sam, the security is 10 times what it was last week. They've got snipers on the first platform and a squad of SS at every pillar." "Ennie, my dear, security is a matter of perspective," I said, my gears clicking with a sharp rhythmic confidence. "A German soldier is trained to look for a saboteur in a dark coat, or perhaps a girl with a satchel of dynamite. He is not trained to look for a 7-foot-tall Victorian gentleman made of brass, who is currently fueled by pure, unadulterated spite and a final sack of Welsh anthracite. I shall be the invisible man of the industrial age, mostly because they won't believe their own eyes until I've already stepped on their toes." The ascent of the insult. We didn't take the stairs. Stairs are for people with fragile kneecaps and a respect for the laws of architectural transit. Instead, I used my hydraulic claws to scale the outer lattice work of the south pillar, moving with a ponderous but steady clank that I hoped the Germans would mistake for the natural groaning of the iron under the night wind. "Quietly, Sam," Ennie hissed, clinging to my back like a particularly anxious barnacle. "I am a whisper in a foundry, Ennie," I muttered back, though my weight caused the iron girders to sing with a low-frequency hum that probably rattled every wine glass within 3 blocks. We reached the second platform, bypassing a pair of sentries who were too busy staring at the distant smoking silhouette of the Mecha-Hitler to notice a brass statue climbing past them. I reached the main junction for the tower's searchlight array, a massive collection of lamps that the Germans had been using to scan the skies for Allied bombers. "Right," I said, my brass fingers deftly ripping open the electrical casing. "Now, for the message. Ennie, hold the lantern. I need to bypass the primary breakers and slave the shutter system to my own logic center." "What are you going to say to it, Sam?" "I am going to deliver a critique of the new order that is both concise and devastating," I replied. "I have spent years perfecting the art of the literary jab. I have poked fun at Congress, I have mocked the nobility, and I once spent an entire evening insulting a man's choice of cravat until he moved to another state. But this is my masterpiece. The final message." I began to program the sequence. This wasn't Morse code for the Allies. This was a direct, plain text broadcast to the ego of the machine currently crushing the streets of Paris. I wanted every German soldier, every French citizen, and most importantly, every sensor on that diesel-powered nightmare to see it. "Ready?" I asked, my internal pressure reaching its peak. "Ready," Ennie breathed. I slammed the final contact into place. The sky over Paris didn't just light up, it erupted. The massive searchlights atop the Eiffel Tower, boosted by my own internal capacitors, began to pulse and sweep with a frantic, blinding intensity. But they weren't searching the clouds. They were projecting letters, vast glowing symbols of fire, onto the low-hanging smoke of the city and the very walls of the buildings. The message flashed in rhythmic, taunting bursts. "To the diesel-drinking toaster in the streets." Pause for effect. "Your mustache is crooked." Another pause, as the searchlight swiveled toward the location of Die Eisenfaust. "Your logic is rusty. Your leader is a paperweight. Meet me at the Trocadéro if you have the bolts to face a real machine or admit you are merely a glorified laundry press." The reaction of the beast. The effect was instantaneous. Far off in the distance, the black smoke from Da Eisenfaust's exhaust suddenly doubled in volume, turning into a towering pillar of soot. The machine stopped its forward march. I could imagine the primitive logic boards inside that armored head whirring with a confusion that bordered on physical pain. A dictator can survive an army. He can survive a famine. He can even survive a bad haircut. But he cannot survive being called a laundry press on the side of the Eiffel Tower. The machine's loudspeaker, that booming metallic voice of the leader, erupted in a scream of incoherent rage. "Verräter! Untermensch! Ich werde dich zerquetschen!" "He's taking the bait," Ennie said, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "Sam, he's turning around. He's coming this way." "Of course he is," I said, watching as the massive square head of the Mecha-Hitler swiveled toward the tower, its red optical sensors glowing like the embers of a dying empire. I have insulted his parentage, his engineering, and his facial hair. In the Handbook of Tyranny, there is no chapter on how to ignore a robot who calls you a toaster. The ground began to shake again, but this time the rhythm was faster. Die Eisenfaust was no longer stomping, it was charging, or at least it was moving at the highest speed its overburdened treads would allow. It plowed through a stone wall and flattened a row of parked cars, its cannons swiveling wildly as it sought the source of the insult. The lure is set. "It's time to go, Ennie," I said, unhooking my interface from the tower's lights. "The guest of honor is on his way, and he sounds like he's in a bit of a temper. We need to be at the Trocadéro before he arrives. I want the lighting to be just right for his final performance." "Sam," Ennie said as we began our rapid descent down the North Pillar, "you realize that once we're at the Trocadéro, there's nowhere else to run? If your plan doesn't work, he's just going to step on us." "My dear, a good story always needs a dramatic conclusion," I replied, my brass legs clanking against the iron struts as we slid down toward the street level. And what could be more dramatic than a duel between a creature of steam and a creature of diesel? It's a battle between the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a fight between wit and weight. And if there is one thing I know about weight, it's that it's remarkably easy to trip up if you can get it to stop thinking. We hit the ground running, or in my case, a high-speed gallop that sent sparks flying from the pavement. Behind us, the Eiffel Tower remained lit, the final words of my insult still glowing against the Parisian sky like a promise. "Your mustache is crooked." I chuckled to myself as we vanished into the side streets heading for the Trocadéro. The war was far from over, but the secret weapon of the Reich was currently being led by the nose by a sentence. And I, Mecha-TwAIN, was about to provide the exclamation point. "Chapter 42, I muttered to Ennie as we dodged a German motorcycle patrol. "The part where you tell me how we're actually going to win this thing. I hope it involves more than just my winning personality." "It involves a cinema projector, Sam," she said, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "And a very old friend of yours named Charlie." "Ah," I said, my firebox glowing with a sudden warm understanding. "The little tramp. I should have known. There is no better weapon against a great dictator than a man with a baggy pair of pants and a very funny walk." The stage was set. The beast was coming, and Paris was about to witness a show it would never forget. Chapter 42. Ennie's Plan. The Trocadéro at midnight is usually a place for lovers to sigh, for poets to contemplate the moon, and for the occasional pickpocket to conduct a silent audit of a tourist's coat. It is a grand sweeping terrace that looks across the Seine at the Eiffel Tower, with an air of architectural superiority. But tonight, it felt less like a promenade and more like the deck of a sinking ship. The ground was vibrating with a rhythmic, bone-deep thrum that suggested a very large, very angry mountain was currently jogging toward us. I stood near the stone balustrade, my internal firebox throwing long orange shadows against the statues of the Palais de Chaillot. I was checking the tension on my primary piston actuators and wondering if a 7-foot-tall brass gentleman could, in a pinch, suplex a 20-foot-tall diesel-powered monstrosity. "Sam," Ennie said, pulling a heavy canvas bag from behind a marble pillar. She looked at me with the weary patience of a school teacher dealing with a particularly dim-witted but enthusiastic pupil. "Stop posing. You're trying to calculate how to punch that thing, aren't you?" "It is a natural impulse, Ennie," I replied, my voice box emitting a sharp metallic click. "I am a creature of the Industrial Revolution. When faced with a rival piece of machinery that is both ugly and impolite, the ancestral urge is to reduce it to its component washers. I have 3 tons of reinforced brass and a sense of moral outrage. Surely that counts for something in a street fight." "It counts for about 3 seconds of being a very expensive pancake," she countered. "Die Eisenfaust is covered in 5-inch Krupp steel. Its fists are the size of your entire torso, and it has cannons where you have sarcasm. We can't outshoot it, Sam. We have to outthink it." The architecture of the impossible. I let out a plume of steam that smelled faintly of the Welsh coal's dying embers. Outthink it? My dear girl, I have an analytical engine designed by Babbage and refined by a man who could outtalk a Mississippi con artist. My thinking is done at a frequency that would make a telegraph wire blush. But logic rarely stops a battleship on treads. "Exactly," Ennie said, her eyes sparking with a dangerous, brilliant light. "And that's the weakness. That machine isn't just steel, it's a logic loop. The technicians in Berlin didn't give it a soul. They gave it a set of inviolable directives. It is programmed to recognize the leader, to obey the leader, and to destroy anything that mocks the leader." A common enough failing in the German military, I noted. But she continued, pulling a heavy blackened device from her bag, a cinema projector that looked like it had survived a riot. "It's a primitive machine. Its optical sensors are designed to perceive reality as a series of targets. It doesn't understand the difference between a man and a shadow. It doesn't understand irony." The Chaplin Gambit. She laid out the plan with the cold, surgical precision of a watchmaker. It was a plan so absurd, so profoundly ridiculous, that I felt my copper wiring throb with a sudden, intense respect for the human capacity for mischief. The lure. We stay at the Trocadéro, keeping the final message on the Eiffel Tower lit to ensure the beast's undivided attention. The medium. We utilize a high-intensity cinema projector, boosted by my own internal boiler pressure, to cast a specific image. The weapon. We don't use a shell or a bullet. We use Chapter 43's objective, a specific reel of film from a banned cinema in the Latin Quarter. The logic bomb. We project the image of a certain great dictator, the funny one, not the scary one, directly onto the smoke of the battlefield or a nearby wall. You see, Sam, Ennie explained, the Mecha-Hitler's primitive AI will see the projection. It will see the mustache, the uniform, and the frantic gestures. Its programming will tell it that it is looking at its creator, but the creator will be saying things and doing things that contradict its prime directives. It will experience a mechanical paradox. I realized, my gears whirring at a furious pace. It will be ordered to obey the figure in the film, but the figure in the film will be telling it to, what did you say, surrender to a cat? Or dance the polka, Ennie added with a smirk. The logic board will overheat, trying to reconcile the sacred image with the nonsensical command. It'll be like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole if the peg was made of dynamite and the hole was a furnace. The critique of pure reason. I paced the stone terrace, my heavy feet leaving white scars on the marble. Ennie, this is more than just a plan. It is a work of high-concept satire. It is the ultimate literary revenge. The Germans have built a machine to embody their iron will, and we are going to defeat it by showing it a comedy. It is a duel between the tragic and the absurd. It's a duel between us and a 20-foot-tall toaster, Sam, she reminded me, and we're currently missing the most important part. We need the film. The only copy of Chaplin's The Great Dictator in Paris is hidden in a vault beneath a cinema that the Gestapo closed last year. If we don't get that reel, your satire is just going to be us getting stepped on while you quote poetry. I stopped and looked across the river. The black smoke of Die Eisenfaust was closer now. I could hear the sound of stone buildings being ground to dust as it bypassed the narrow streets by simply walking through them. It was a terrifying, inexorable sound, the sound of an ego that had forgotten how to yield. Then we have a heist to conduct, I said, my optical sensors narrowing to sharp points of amber. A cinema heist. I've always wanted to break into a theater. It's the only way to get a decent seat without paying the outrageous prices for popcorn. The weight of the gamble. Ennie looked at the approaching darkness, her hand resting on my brass forearm. Sam, if the projector fails or if the logic board is more advanced than I think, you'll have to hold it off. Physically. I looked down at her, then back at the distant, glowing red eyes of the Mecha-Hitler. My dear Ennie, I have survived the Mississippi floods, the critics of the New York Times, and the invention of the electric light bulb. A diesel-powered laundry press with a welded mustache does not intimidate me. If it comes to a physical confrontation, I shall show that machine the true meaning of Victorian engineering. I may be made of brass, but I was forged in an age when things were built to last, not just to look scary in a parade. I adjusted the pressure in my left arm, feeling the hydraulic fluid surge with a satisfying thrum. But, I added, a snarky click emanating from my throat, I would much prefer the Chaplin plan. There is something deeply satisfying about the idea of a dictator being defeated by a man with a baggy pair of pants. It's a much more TwAIN ending. The departure for Chapter 43. The ground shook again, more violently this time. A piece of the balustrade crumbled and fell into the Seine. Die Eisenfaust was entering the Trocadéro district. "Let's go," Ennie said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "The cinema is 6 blocks away. We have 20 minutes before that thing reaches the terrace." 20 minutes? I chuckled as I began to gallop down the steps toward the street level. In 20 minutes, I could write a short story, insult a general, and still have time for a cigar. To the Latin Quarter, Ennie. We have a movie to catch, and I believe we're about to miss the previews. As we vanished into the side streets, leaving the Eiffel Tower to glow like a lighthouse in a storm of iron, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. We were no longer just refugees or saboteurs. We were the curators of a very dangerous museum. We were fighting for the right to laugh, and in a world of gray steel and diesel fumes, laughter was the only thing that hadn't been requisitioned. "Outthink it," I muttered to myself, my pistons pumping with a newfound purpose. "Yes, Ennie, we shall outthink it until its very bolts rattle with the embarrassment of its own existence." Chapter 43. The Cinema Heist. It has long been my contention that the human race's most baffling invention is the theater. It is a place where perfectly sensible people pay good money to sit in the dark and watch other people pretend to be someone they are not, usually while suffering from a series of dramatic misunderstandings that could be solved by 5 minutes of honest conversation and a stiff drink. And the cinema? That is even more peculiar. It is the worship of shadows. It is the belief that a flicker of light on a bedsheet is more real than the person sitting in the next seat over. But tonight, the shadows were our only hope. We were in the heart of the Latin Quarter, a district that usually smelled of student protests and cheap tobacco, but currently smelled like fear and wet cobblestones. The Cinema de l'Aube, the cinema of the dawn, sat before us, its doors boarded up with a finality that suggested the sunrise had been canceled by order of the local commandant. It was a charming little rotunda of a building, now looking like a sad, blinded owl huddled under a street lamp. "Sam," Ennie whispered, looking at the heavy padlocks on the front doors, "the Gestapo didn't just close this place, they practically entombed it. They heard a rumor that the owner was showing forbidden British comedies in the basement. They probably took the keys with them to Berlin. A padlock, Ennie, is merely a formal invitation for a machine of my caliber to express himself," I said, my brass joints emitting a low-frequency hum as I stepped toward the entrance. The German lock is a masterpiece of precision engineering, which is to say, it is complicated, stubborn, and entirely unprepared for 3 tons of brass applied with a philosophical shrug and a high-pressure piston. I reached out a brass hand, my fingers clicking into a specialized grip. With a short, sharp burst of hydraulic power, clack, crunch, the padlock didn't so much open as it ceased to exist in a coherent form. I pushed the doors open, the wood groaning in a way that sounded remarkably like a librarian being asked to shush. The atmosphere of the forbidden. The interior of the Cinema de l'Aube was a tomb for the imagination. The air was thick with the scent of stale popcorn, dust, and the lingering ghost of 1,000 French sighs. Row upon row of velvet seats sat in the gloom, waiting for an audience that had been requisitioned by history. "It's eerie," Ennie said, her footsteps echoing off the marble floor. "It is a sanctuary, my dear," I corrected, my ocular sensors scanning the darkness. "Art is the only thing the Reich cannot conquer, so they simply try to hide it. They think that by boarding up the doors, they can stop the ideas. It's like trying to stop a river by yelling at the water. It only makes the river want to flow faster. We moved toward the back of the house, heading for the stairs that led to the projection booth. This was the most delicate part of the operation, not because of the Germans, but because of the architecture. "Sam, the stairs," Ennie pointed out. "They're narrow and wooden and about 50 years older than your latest upgrade." I looked at the spiraling staircase. It looked like a corkscrew made of matches. "I shall have to exercise a level of grace that is frankly unnatural for a creature of my density," I admitted. "Ennie, you go ahead. I shall attempt to climb these stairs with the delicacy of a ballerina, provided the ballerina is made of reinforced brass and is currently experiencing a slight leak in her left steam seal." The ascent of the iron ballerina. What followed was a feat of mechanical gymnastics that I hope will never be recorded in any official history. I ascended the stairs by gripping the central iron pillar and lifting my entire weight with each step, my pistons hissing in a rhythmic, muffled protest. Every time I moved, the wood let out a scream of agony that suggested I was currently murdering the building's foundations. "Quietly, Sam!" Ennie hissed from above. "I am a mountain breeze, Ennie, a silent 3-ton mountain breeze," I whispered back, my voice box rattling with the effort. I reached the projection booth, a tiny, cramped room that smelled of ozone and nitrate film, and discovered that I was approximately 4 inches wider than the doorway. I had to rotate my torso 45 degrees and suck in my primary boiler vents just to squeeze through, a process that felt remarkably like a ship trying to navigate a bathtub. "I am in," I announced, my brass plating scraping against the doorframe with a sound that probably woke up every German for 3 blocks. "And I have decided that if I ever build a theater, the projectionist shall be given a room large enough for a man to change his mind in, let alone his clothes." The search for the logic bomb. The booth was a chaotic jumble of canisters, spare lenses, and the heavy black machinery of the projectors. Ennie was already frantically reading the labels on the film tins, her flashlight dancing over the French titles. "Méliès, Renoir, more Renoir," she muttered. "Sam, there's nothing here, just the approved propaganda reels and a few old silents. The Chaplin reel isn't here." I scanned the room with my high-intensity optical sensors. "Ennie, look at the floorboards near the far corner. My thermal sensors indicate a slight variance in the air temperature coming from below. The air is cooler, and it smells of, yes, the scent of a secret." I stepped toward the corner, my heavy feet causing the floor to sag in a way that would have made a structural engineer faint. I reached down and, with a gentle application of my hydraulic claws, peeled back the rug and a loose plank of oak. Beneath was a small lead-lined box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of red silk, was a single battered film tin. There was no label, only a small hand-drawn picture of a man with a bowler hat and a very distinctive, very rebellious mustache. "The little tramp," Ennie breathed, lifting the tin as if it were a holy relic. "The great Dictator. The critique of the real." I looked at the tin, my analytical engine whirring with a sense of profound satisfaction. A masterpiece of subversion, Ennie. Chaplin understood something the Germans never will, that you cannot fight a monster by becoming one. You fight him by showing everyone how ridiculous he looks when he's trying to be scary. This reel is more powerful than 100 regiments of infantry. It is the ultimate logic bomb. But will it work on the Mecha-Hitler? Ennie asked, clutching the tin to her chest. A machine is built on a foundation of absolutes, I explained. The Mecha-Hitler is programmed to revere the image of the leader. It is its North Star. But Chaplin's performance is a distortion. It takes the sacred iconography of the Reich and turns it into a farce. When that diesel-powered monstrosity sees this, its logic boards will be forced to choose between the image and the order. It will be like asking a man to believe that up is down, while he's currently fallen off a cliff. The complication. Suddenly, the floor beneath us didn't just vibrate, it groaned. A sound like a low-frequency thunderclapping echoed through the theater. I felt the glass in the projection booth window rattle, then shatter. "He's here," Ennie whispered, her face turning pale in the flashlight's beam. I looked out the shattered window. Far down the Rue de la Harpe, I could see the glow of red optical sensors. Die Eisenfaust was no longer blocks away. It had arrived in the Latin Quarter, and it was currently using a 19th century apartment building as a footstool. The sound of its diesel engine was a wet, rhythmic thumping that seemed to sync up with my own internal pressure. "The beast has followed the trail of my insults," I noted, my gears clicking with a grim excitement. It seems he took the laundry press comment personally. We have the reel, Ennie, but we no longer have the luxury of a polite exit. "How are we going to get down?" Ennie asked, looking at the tiny, screaming staircase. "If you try to go down that way now, you'll bring the whole booth down with you." "A valid point," I agreed. I looked at the large, reinforced glass window that looked out over the street. "Ennie, do you remember when I told you I was an invisible man of the industrial age?" "Yes." I lied. I am, in fact, a kinetic projectile of the industrial age. I scooped Ennie up with one arm, securing her against my chest plate. I felt the film tin tucked safely into her bag. I began to build up the steam pressure in my primary leg struts, the brass joints glowing a dull, angry red. "Sam, what are you—" "Brace yourself, my dear. We are about to provide the Cinema de l'Aube with its very first three-dimensional, high-impact finale. The exit." I didn't run. I launched. I hit the window with the force of a falling anvil, the reinforced glass exploding into a million shimmering shards. For a brief, glorious second, we were airborne. A 7-foot-tall brass machine and a girl suspended against the backdrop of an occupied city and a burning sky. We hit the cobblestones 50 feet below with a shock that sent a bolt of lightning through my copper wiring and likely caused a minor earthquake in the next arrondissement. My hydraulic shock absorbers hissed in agony, but the struts held. I stood up, shaking the glass from my shoulders, just as the massive square head of the Mecha-Hitler rounded the corner of the street. The machine stopped. Its red eyes swiveled down toward us, the diesel smoke from its exhaust turning into a black shroud. The loudspeaker in its throat let out a sound of pure, mechanical hatred. "Verräter!" it bellowed. "Good evening, Your Excellency," I shouted back, my voice box projecting with a booming, brassy resonance. "I'm afraid the show is sold out, but we've managed to save a special seat for you at the Trocadéro. We're showing a comedy. I think you'll find the lead actor remarkably familiar." "Sam, run!" Ennie screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and began a high-speed gallop toward the Seine, my pistons pumping with a renewed vigor. Behind us, The Mecha-Hitler let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the Latin Quarter and began to stomp after us, its massive treads chewing up the pavement like a hungry beast. The cinema heist was a success. We had the film, we had the bait, and now we had a 20-foot-tall critic chasing us through the streets of Paris. Chapter 44, I muttered, my exhaust venting a plume of white steam to mask our retreat. The part where we see if coal can truly outrun diesel. I hope the stoker is feeling ambitious tonight, because I'm about to ask my boiler for a miracle. The final showdown was approaching, and the shadows of the cinema were about to become the brightest light in the world. Chapter 44, Coal versus Diesel. There is a fundamental ideological chasm between a steam engine and an internal combustion motor that no amount of diplomatic grease can ever truly bridge. A steam engine is a creature of character. It breathes, it sighs, and it possesses a certain Victorian temperament that requires a gentle hand and a persuasive vocabulary. A diesel engine, however, is a cynical, modern brute. It doesn't breathe. It explodes. It is the mechanical equivalent of a man who shouts his dinner orders and never leaves a tip. We were currently being pursued through the winding cobblestone arteries of the Latin Quarter by the ultimate expression of this diesel-powered arrogance. Die Eisenfaust was not so much running as it was deleting the geography between us. Every time its massive tread struck the earth, it sounded like the planet was being hit by a very heavy, very angry rhythmic hammer. "Sam!" Ennie screamed, her fingers digging into the brass seams of my shoulder as I galloped at a pace that was severely testing my structural integrity. "He's leveling the buildings. He isn't even following the road anymore." "A hallmark of the dictatorial mind, Ennie," I bellowed back, my voice box rattling against my primary boiler. "Why follow a path when you can simply flatten the neighbors? It's the ultimate shortcut for those who lack the patience for civil engineering." The skirmish of the eras. The gap was closing. My analytical engine was frantically calculating the rate of impending squashing R sub S, a variable that was currently trending toward inevitability. R sub S equals M sub H times V sub D over delta times Pi, where M sub H equals mass of the Mecha-Hitler, roughly equivalent to a small cathedral. V sub D equals velocity of the diesel treads. Delta equals the distance between his fist and my posterior. Pi equals the irrationality of our current situation. Suddenly, a shadow the size of a city block fell over us. I glanced back, a mistake, as it nearly caused my optical sensors to fuse from sheer terror. Die Eisenfaust had raised one of its massive, blocky arms. It didn't look like a limb. It looked like a falling apartment complex. "Du wirst nicht entkommen!" the machine roared, the amplified voice of the leader vibrating my very rivets. "I've heard better arguments from a Missouri mule with a head cold," I shouted back, though I suspect the sentiment was lost in the sound of his fist meeting the pavement exactly where I had been 2 milliseconds prior. The shock wave sent me stumbling forward, my brass shins throwing sparks as they scraped the stone. The impact didn't just break the cobblestones, it pulverized them into a fine gray powder. I felt the heat from his exhaust, a foul-smelling, oily cloud that made my own clean, burning steam feel like a spring breeze. The duel of thermal efficiency. "Ennie," I wheezed, my pressure gauges spinning like a dervish at a wedding. I am currently operating at 110% of my rated capacity. If I don't vent some of this enthusiasm soon, I shall become a very large, very loud piece of brass confetti. "Don't you dare blow up now, Sam," she yelled, clutching the Chaplin film reel to her chest. "We're almost to the bridge." The Mecha-Hitler let out a sound like a metallic cough, the sound of its massive diesel cylinders priming for a secondary burst. From its shoulder-mounted cannons, a twin flash of fire erupted. The shells didn't hit us. They hit the bakery to our left, turning a perfectly good supply of baguettes into a cloud of toasted shrapnel. "What a waste of flour!" I lamented. "It's a criminal misuse of artillery. To fire upon a croissant is to declare war on civilization itself." The beast was upon us again. Its red eyes glowed with a dull, unthinking malice. It didn't have the wit to lead, but it certainly had the weight to follow. This was the clash of the ages, my refined external combustion wisdom against its crude internal combustion rage. The steam-powered vanishing act. "Sam, he's got us cornered," Ennie cried as we veered into a narrow alleyway that ended in a massive iron gate. I looked at the gate, then at the 20-foot-tall wall of steel thundering toward us. Logic dictated that we were about to become a decorative mural on the alley wall, but logic, as I have often noted, is a poor substitute for a well-timed safety valve failure. "Ennie, hold your breath," I commanded. I didn't just vent steam. I initiated a total boiler purge. I opened every relief valve, every exhaust port, and every decorative whistle on my chassis simultaneously. The result was a white, roiling wall of high-pressure vapor that erupted from my frame with the roar of 1,000 angry tea kettles. Within seconds, the alley was filled with a fog so dense, so blindingly white, that the Mecha-Hitler's optical sensors were rendered utterly useless. It was as if we had been swallowed by a cloud that had developed a very bad attitude. "Whoa, bist du!" The machine bellowed, its giant hands flailing blindly in the mist. I heard the sound of the iron gate being crumpled like tinfoil as it stomped through the fog, missing us by a mere 6 inches. The bare escape. Under the cover of my own artificial weather system, I performed a sharp 90-degree turn and ducked into the cellar entrance of a nearby laundromat. I lowered my chassis until I was practically crawling, my brass plating still hissing and clicking as it cooled in the damp air. We sat in the dark, listening to the rhythmic thud squelch of the diesel beast as it stomped past our hiding spot, its logic boards likely screaming in confusion. Is he gone?" Ennie whispered, her heart beating against my torso. "He is currently searching for us in a cloud of his own bewilderment," I replied, my voice box set to its lowest, most conspiratorial hum. "My steam screen worked, but at a terrible cost, Ennie. I've lost 5 pounds of pressure and most of my dignity as a dry-running machine. I feel like I've been through a particularly violent Turkish bath. I checked my internal diagnostics. I was dented, I was soot-stained, and my left leg actuator was making a sound like a cricket with a grudge. But we were alive, and more importantly, we still had the film. The lessons of the skirmish. "Sam," Ennie said, leaning against my brass leg, "that thing is faster than it looks. We can't keep running forever." Running was never the goal, my dear. I said, watching the last of my steam dissipate through the cellar vents. The goal was to see if he could be led, and he can. Die Eisenfaust is a creature of momentum. It lacks the ability to stop and think because, quite frankly, its designers forgot to include the think part. It is a machine built to win a race, not a debate. I looked at the film tin in her hands. We've seen the brute force of the 20th century, Ennie. Now it's time we showed the Trocadéro what happens when the 19th century, armed with a projector and a sense of humor, finally fights back. That skirmish was just the prologue. The main event is still to come. I let out a final tiny toot from my smallest whistle. But first, if you could find me a damp cloth and perhaps a small amount of oil, I'd appreciate it. I believe I have a bit of Hitler soot in my gears, and it's given me a dreadful craving for a very loud, very public argument. The first skirmish was over. Cole had met Diesel, and while Diesel had the muscle, Cole still had the mist. We were heading for Chapter 45, and the project was about to get personal. Chapter 45, The Projector. If there is one thing a gentleman of the Gilded Age possesses in abundance, it is a sense of physical dignity. A man might lose his fortune in a railstock collapse. He might lose his reputation in a scandalous duel over a misunderstood wink, and he might even lose his hat in a high wind. But he rarely expects to be turned into a piece of tripod furniture for a French cinematic device. We were still hunkered down in the cellar of the laundromat, surrounded by the scent of lye and the damp, heavy silence of a city waiting for its executioner. I sat upon a crate of industrial soap, my brass joints cooling with a series of rhythmic metallic tinks that sounded like a clock shop having a nervous breakdown. Ennie was currently perched upon my left shoulder, her brow furrowed in a manner that usually preceded a significant amount of mechanical violence. "Sam," she muttered, a screwdriver gripped between her teeth as she worked on my primary shoulder strut. "Stop twitching. I'm trying to tap into your secondary electrical arc. If I hit the wrong wire, you're going to start reciting the jumping frog story in high-voltage Morse code." "My dear Ennie," I replied, my voice box emitting a slightly garbled, bass-heavy hum, "I am not twitching. I am merely vibrating with the indignity of the situation. I was built to be a chronicler of the human condition, an observer of the grand parade of folly. I was not designed to be a mobile magic lantern for the entertainment of a diesel-powered tyrant." The architecture of the shadow caster. The plan, while brilliant in its absurdity, required a level of physical modification that my blueprints had never anticipated. To deliver the logic bomb, the cinema projector had to be integrated directly into my own power systems. Ennie was performing a feat of improvised engineering that would have made a patent officer faint from sheer exhaustion. She was bolting the heavy cast-iron frame of the Cinema de Lobes projector to my left shoulder plate using a series of reinforced brass brackets she'd liberated from a nearby steam press. The shadow caster specifications: power source, a direct tap into my primary copper wound armature, fueled by the last glowing embers of the Welsh coal. Optics, a high-intensity carbon arc lamp capable of throwing a beam through a Parisian fog thick enough to stop a bullet. Stabilization, my own internal gyroscopes normally used to keep me from falling over during a particularly heated argument. Projector feed, hand-cranked by Ennie, slaved to the rhythm of my own heart piston. "There," she said, giving a final satisfying twist to a bolt that felt remarkably like a pinched nerve in my upper cervical assembly. "It's solid. You look like a cross between a lighthouse and a very confused gargoyle." The aesthetic critique. I adjusted my neck joint, feeling the unaccustomed weight on my left side. I looked at my reflection in a large cracked mirror leaning against the laundry tubs. I was no longer the sleek Victorian gentleman of the Mississippi. I was a patchwork of war and art, a brass man with a cinema projector growing out of his shoulder like a mechanical tumor. "I look like a mistake made by a committee of drunk watchmakers," I observed. "It is a look that suggests I have either invented a new form of photography or I am about to offer the Germans a very expensive slideshow of my last vacation. Is the chaplain reel secure?" "Tucked in and ready to roll," Ennie said, patting the film canister now mounted to the projector side. "I've rigged the lens to focus at 50 yards. As soon as you open your primary steam vent to boost the arc lamp, we'll have the brightest screen in France." "It's a funny thing, Ennie," I said, my ocular sensors softening to a warm amber. "Throughout history, men have fought for the truth. They have died for it, lied for it, and occasionally even recognized it when it hit them in the face. But tonight, we are going to fight for the truth by using a fiction. We are going to save Paris with a strip of celluloid and the ghost of a man with a funny walk. The thrum of the beast." Suddenly, the laundry tubs began to dance. A fine layer of plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling, coating my brass head in a gray shroud. The thrumming was back, deeper, closer, and more rhythmic. Die Eisenfaust had found our trail. The machine was moving through the Latin Quarter with the persistence of a debt collector. "He's searching the blocks," Ennie whispered, her hand moving to the crank of the projector. "He knows we're close." "Let him search," I said, standing up and feeling the new balance of my weighted frame. "He is looking for a fugitive. He is not looking for a premiere. Ennie, it is time to head to the Trocadéro. The stage is set, the audience is gathered, and I believe I have just enough coal left to provide the special effects." I reached into my torso and pulled out the very last lump of the Welsh anthracite. It was small, shiny, and felt like a promise of clarity. In a world gone dark, I dropped it into my firebox and heard the immediate hungry roar of the flames as they tasted the high-carbon fuel. "Ah," I sighed, a perfectly white puff of steam escaping my lips. "That is the stuff. My brain feels like it's been washed in lightning. If I'm to be a tripod, at least I shall be a tripod with a superior vocabulary and a perfectly focused lens." The march to the Trocadéro. We slipped out of the laundry cellar and into the cool night air of Paris. The city was a ghost of its former self, illuminated only by the distant sweeping searchlights of the Eiffel Tower and the red, malevolent glow of the Mecha-Hitler's sensors a few streets away. I moved with a new kind of purpose. The weight of the projector gave me a slight list to the left, which I compensated for by swinging my right arm in a manner that I considered rakish, but which Ennie described as dangerously unstable. "Sam," she whispered as we crossed the Pont d'Iéna, "look at the Trocadéro. The Germans are there. They've set up a perimeter. They're waiting for the show." "Of course they are," I replied. "The German mind cannot resist a spectacle, especially one that promises the destruction of an enemy. They have gathered to watch their god crush the Iron Ghost. It is a classic tragedy in the making, except for the fact that I've decided to turn it into a farce." We reached the shadows of the Palais de Chaillot, the grand curved wings of the building looming over us like the arms of a stone giant. I could see the Mecha-Hitler now. It had reached the far end of the terrace, its massive treads chewing up the decorative gravel. It stood there, silhouetted against the night sky, a 20-foot-tall monument to the death of irony. "It's time, Ennie," I said, locking my hydraulic knee struts into place and anchoring myself against a marble plinth. "The beast is in the center of the ring. Load the first reel. I shall provide the light. You provide the laughter." The final preparation. Ennie climbed up onto my shoulder, her fingers nimble as she threaded the film through the projector's gate. I felt the surge of electricity through my copper wiring, a hot, tingling sensation that made my logic gates hum with a feverish intensity. "Ready, Sam?" she asked, her voice steady despite the monster thudding toward us. "My dear," I said, my ocular sensors zooming in on the welded steel mustache of our opponent, "I have been ready for this since the day they first bolted my head on. Let us show this diesel-powered appliance that in the end, the pen is mightier than the sword, and the projector is mightier than the panzer." I opened my primary steam vent, and the carbon arc lamp behind the lens flickered to life with a blinding white-hot hiss. The logic bomb was armed. The show was about to begin. Chapter 47, The Great Dictator. A machine is a creature of binaries. It understands yes and no. It understands forward and stop. It has no room in its copper-plated brain for maybe, and it certainly has no room for hilarious. To a machine like Die Eisenfaust, reality is a series of hard edges and cold facts. But art, true, subversive art, is nothing but soft edges and warm lies that tell a greater truth. As Ennie cranked the projector handle, the white beam of the carbon arc lamp carved a tunnel through the thick diesel smog of the Trocadéro. The light splashed against the limestone wall of the Palais de Chaillot, and for a moment the world of 1944 flickered and faded. In its place stood a ghost from 1940, a man with a baggy suit, a twitching mustache, and a globe of the world that he treated like a soap bubble. "Look at him, Sam," Ennie whispered, her voice trembling as she kept the rhythm of the film steady. "He's beautiful." "He is more than beautiful, Ennie," I rumbled, my internal brass gears clicking in a slow rhythmic appreciation. "He is a catastrophe for the humorless. He is the little tramp playing the part of the great dictator, and he is doing the one thing that no tyrant can survive. He is being a nincompoop." The optical paradox. On the wall, the character of Adenoid Hinkle began his frantic, gibberish-filled speech. It was a masterpiece of phonetic slapstick. All Guttens and Stoltens and sauerkraut barked with a ferocity that mimicked the leader's own voice with terrifying accuracy. The effect on the Mecha-Hitler was profound. The 20-foot-tall monstrosity froze mid-stride, its massive treads ground to a halt, sending a shower of decorative gravel against the stone balustrade. The red optical sensors, vast, unblinking saucers of unthinking malice, swiveled toward the projection. I could practically hear the logic boards inside that armored bucket of a head screaming in agony. Internal logic. Intercept. Die Eisenfaust Unit 01. Visual input. Primary icon detected. Pattern. Match. 98.4% correlation with the leader. Audio input. Command sequences detected. Parsing. Conflict error. Commands consist of polka rhythm and inexplicable salad references. Logical paradox. The leader is commanding a surrender to a balloon. Directive. Obey the leader. Status. Recalibrating. Recalibrating. He's stuck! Ennie cried, a wild, joyful laugh breaking through her fear. Sam, his brain is looping. It's more than a loop, my dear, I noted, my firebox glowing a steady, contented violet. It's a systemic irony failure. The machine is programmed to recognize the mustache and the uniform as the ultimate authority. But the authority is currently bouncing a globe off its backside. The Mecha Hitler is trying to reconcile the dignity of the Reich with the slapstick of the century. It's like asking a calculator to divide by zero while it's being tickled. The audience of the absurd. The two companies of SS soldiers stood paralyzed. They had been trained to fear the machine, to worship the machine, and to die for the man the machine represented. But now their mechanical god was standing still, watching a giant, flickering parody of their leader act like a petulant child on a limestone wall. I saw a young Oberleutnant drop his rifle, not out of surrender, but out of sheer bone-deep confusion. To see the iron will distracted by a comedy is to realize that the will itself might just be a very loud joke. "Soldiers of the New Order!" I bellowed, my voice box projecting with a booming, brassy resonance that echoed across the Seine. "Witness your champion! Behold the Eisenfaust as it receives its final orders! It seems your great leader has decided that the war is over, and it's time for a very long, very silly dance." The great dictator's speech. Ennie reached the climax of the film, the final speech, where the barber, disguised as the dictator, speaks of humanity, of kindness, and of the soul of man. It was a moment of profound, quiet power that cut through the diesel fumes in the night air like a surgeon's knife. "We think too much and feel too little," the shadow on the wall proclaimed, its voice amplified by the Trocadéro's natural acoustics. "More than machinery, we need humanity." I felt a strange thrum in my copper wiring. I am a machine, yes, but I was built by a man who understood that the heart is the only engine that truly matters. To hear those words projected from my own shoulder while a 20-foot-tall engine of death looked on in bewilderment was the most satisfying sentence I had ever participated in. Chapter 48. Logic Bomb. There is a peculiar fragility to the absolute. A man who believes he is 10% right can be argued with. A man who believes he is 50% right can be ignored. But a machine programmed to believe it is 100% infallible is a disaster waiting for a punchline. To an analytical engine, there is no such thing as a joke. There is only input and output. If you provide an input that contradicts the core output, the resulting internal struggle is less like a debate and more like a steam boiler attempting to swallow its own whistle. As the final flickering frame of Chaplin's masterpiece faded from the limestone walls of the Palais de Chaillot, die Eisenfaust, the great iron fist of the Reich, began to experience what I would call a total categorical collapse. "Sam," Ennie whispered, shielding her eyes as a violent arc of blue electricity leaped from the machine's neck to its shoulder-mounted cannon. "Is it supposed to make that sound? It sounds like a bag of wet gravel in a centrifuge." "That, my dear, is the sound of a paradox attempting to find a comfortable place to sit," I replied, my own brass joints clicking in a rhythmic, satisfied cadence. "The machine's optical sensors have recorded the image of the leader. Its logic gates have verified the mustache, the uniform, and the frantic gesticulations. But its linguistic sub-processors are currently trying to reconcile the sacred will with a series of commands regarding the proper way to shave a balloon. It is a logic bomb of the highest order, a blast of pure, unadulterated nonsense. The anatomy of the overload. A machine built on the principles of the new order is a prisoner of its own definitions. It recognizes power by its silhouette. By projecting Chaplin onto the battlefield, we hadn't just shown a movie. We had rewritten the machine's reality. Internal logic. Intercept. Die. Eisen-Faust Unit 01. Current command. Soldiers, do not give yourselves to brutes. Source. Verified leader icon. Mustache. Match. 99.8%. Conflict. Directives 01 to 10 mandate giving oneself to brutes, as defined by the state. Resolution. Attempt. Rerouting logic through central hub. Error. Central hub is currently occupied with the dance of the globe. System status. Critical ironic overload. "Look at the tread, Sam," Ennie pointed out. The 20-foot-tall monstrosity was no longer moving forward. Instead, its left tread began to lurch forward while its right tread reversed, causing the entire 500-ton mass to spin in a slow, agonizing circle. It looked less like a conqueror and more like a very large, very confused spinning top that had lost its sense of direction. The SS crisis of faith. Around the perimeter, the SS companies were witnessing the unthinkable. Their mechanical god, the embodiment of the iron will, was currently emitting a high-pitched metallic shriek that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed giggle. Major von Strudel, standing on the museum balcony with a look of such profound horror that I feared his monocle might actually fuse to his cheek, began screaming into a megaphone. "Reboot it! Shut it down! It is a subversion!" "Too late, Major!" I bellowed, my voice box projecting with a booming, brassy resonance. "You cannot reboot an idea. Your machine has seen the truth, which is that your leader is a caricature. It is currently attempting to calculate the military value of a pratfall, and I suspect the answer is giving it a headache." The logic bomb detonates. Then came the detonation. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but an explosion of mechanical confusion. A series of internal shutters on the Mecha Hitler's chest began to flap open and shut with the frantic energy of a bird's wings. Its shoulder cannons, rather than firing at us, began to swivel toward the Eiffel Tower and then toward a stray cat crossing the plaza, unable to prioritize a target in a world where the leader was currently a comedian. "Ich bin ein Barbier." I am a barber. The machine's loudspeaker suddenly roared, the recording of the leader's voice distorted into a warbling, high-pitched falsetto. "He's quoting the film." Ennie laughed. Her fear completely vanished, replaced by the sheer, beautiful absurdity of the moment. It's the ultimate triumph of the literary critique, Ennie, I noted, my firebox venting a triumphant plume of white steam. The machine has accepted the fiction as its new primary directive. It is no longer a weapon of war. It is a 20-foot-tall, armored performance artist. And I believe, I added, as the Mecha Hitler's knees gave a sudden spasmodic jerk, it's about to give us an encore. The polka of the damned. With a bone-shaking groan of tortured steel, the Mecha-Hitler began to move, but it wasn't a charge. It was a rhythmic, lumbering skip. The massive treads clattered against the marble of the Trocadéro in a pattern that, if you ignored the sound of breaking stone, bore a striking resemblance to a polka. "Sam," Ennie said, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye, Is it dancing?" "It is the polka of surrender, my dear," I replied, my brass heart piston thumping with a sense of profound accomplishment. "The logic board has burned out the war sector and is currently running on the slapstick backup. By tomorrow morning, the only thing the 15th Army will be able to say about their Iron Fist is that it had a very lovely sense of timing and a complete inability to take its own mustache seriously. The logic bomb had done its work. The iron will had been defeated not by a bigger engine, but by a bigger laugh. "Chapter 49 is next," I muttered, watching the SS officers flee in terror as their skipping god lurched toward them. "The nonsensical orders. I believe the machine is about to tell the German army exactly what to do with their rifles, and I suspect it involves a great deal of flower picking." The liberation of Paris had begun, and it was being announced with the sound of a diesel engine trying to sing. Chapter 49. Nonsensical Orders. The fundamental problem with a chain of command is that it is only as strong as the brain at the top of it. If that brain decides to take a permanent holiday and is replaced by a set of malfunctioning vacuum tubes and the ghost of a confused silent film star, the results are less like a military operation and more like a Sunday school picnic that has been crashed by a troop of intoxicated acrobats. The Trocadéro was no longer a battlefield. It had become a theater of the truly grotesque. Die Eisenfaust, the 20-foot-tall diesel-powered deity of the Third Reich, was currently performing a slow, grinding pirouette that would have made a hippopotamus in a tutu look like a model of grace. Sparks were showering from its mustache like festive fireworks, and its internal cooling system was letting out a sound like a chorus of dying bagpipes. "Sam," Ennie said, her voice trembling with a laughter she could no longer suppress, "look at the Major. I think he's forgotten how to breathe." I adjusted my ocular sensors, focusing on the balcony where Major von Strudel stood. The man's face was a shade of purple that I had previously only seen on overripe plums and certain species of tropical baboon. He was clutching his megaphone with a white-knuckled grip, but no sound was coming out. He was watching his ultimate weapon, the iron manifestation of the Führer's will, turn into the world's largest, most expensive piece of kinetic art. The proclamation of the absurd. Then the loudspeaker in the machine's throat cleared itself with a roar of static that shattered the remaining windows of the Palais de Chaillot. The distorted, amplified voice of the leader, now pitched up 2 octaves into a frantic, chipmunk-like vibrato, erupted across the Seine. Voice, broadcast. Die Eisenfaust Unit, WWII. Achtung! Achtung! New priority directives from the High Command of the Imagination. The war is canceled due to a lack of interest and a surplus of bad tailoring. All soldiers of the glorious Reich are hereby ordered to immediately discard their boots and engage in a vigorous polka. It is a strategic requirement for the liberation of the soul. The 2 companies of SS troops stood in the plaza, their rifles dangling at their sides like useless sticks. They looked at each other, then at the skipping 20-foot-tall monster, then back at each other. The logic of 4 years of occupation was being dismantled by a soundscape of pure, unadulterated gibberish. "They don't know whether to salute it or start dancing, Sam," Ennie whispered. "It is the paralysis of the literal, Ennie," I noted, my firebox glowing a contented violet. "A German soldier is a creature of the word. If the word tells him to invade Poland, he invades Poland. If the word tells him to dance the polka in his socks, his spirit breaks under the weight of the contradiction. We haven't just broken their machine, we've broken their dictionary." The great feline surrender. The Mecha-Hitler's torso swiveled 360 degrees, its shoulder cannons pointed harmlessly at the stars. It took a lurching step toward the line of elite troops, its red eyes flickering with a frantic, strobing green light. "Furthermore!" the loudspeaker shrieked, now quoting a line from the barber's speech in the film, but mixing it with a laundry list I suspect Ennie had left in the projector booth. "The machines that give abundance have left us in want. Therefore, all units are commanded to cease hostilities and surrender immediately to the nearest cat. Cats are the true masters of stealth and possess a superior moral compass. Find a feline and offer it your sidearms." As if on cue, a small black and white stray cat, doubtless the same one the machine had been tracking earlier, sauntered out from behind a marble plinth. It sat down in the middle of the Trocadéro, licked a paw, and looked at the assembled might of the German army with the profound, icy indifference that only a cat can manage. The effect was instantaneous. A young private, his nerves finally snapping like a dry twig, dropped his car 98K with a clatter that echoed through the plaza. He took a hesitant step toward the cat, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a piece of dried sausage. "Hat recht!" "He is right," the private cried, his voice cracking. "Der Kater ist der Chef." The cat is the boss. The collapse of the clockwork. It was the tipping point. Once the first man broke, the facade of the iron will evaporated like steam in a high wind. All across the plaza, men who had spent years being the terror of Europe began to lay down their weapons. Some began to awkwardly hop in place, attempting the strategic polka mandated by their iron god. Others simply sat on the ground, burying their faces in their hands as the absurdity of their situation finally crushed them. "Look at them, Sam," Ennie said, stepping out from behind my brass frame. She looked at the scene, the dancing soldiers, the skipping robot, the indifferent cat, and for the first time in the war, she looked like a girl who didn't have to carry the weight of France on her shoulders. "It's over. We really did it." "We did more than win a battle, Ennie," I said, my brass heart piston thumping with a slow, dignified pride. "We proved that a lie can only survive as long as it is taken seriously. As soon as you add a polka and a cat to the equation, the lie becomes a joke. And no empire in history has ever survived being laughed at by its own artillery. The final breakdown. With a final violent shudder, die Eisenfaust let out a plume of oily black diesel smoke that smelled remarkably like burnt cabbage. Its internal logic boards, unable to reconcile the great dictator with the strategic polka, finally committed mechanical suicide. The machine let out a long, mournful whistle, a sound that I recognized as a direct copy of my own satanic hiss, and its massive square head slumped forward. The red eyes went dark, then turned into a dull, lifeless gray. The 20-foot-tall god of the Reich was now just 20 tons of scrap metal, a monument to the dangers of taking oneself too seriously. Major von Strudel, seeing his troops surrendering to a stray cat and his secret weapon turning into a garden ornament, let out a thin, shrill scream, turned on his heel, and ran back into the museum. He didn't look like a conqueror anymore. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he had left the stove on in Berlin. The dawn of the ridiculous. I looked at my brass hands, stained with the soot of a dozen battles and the grease of a cinema projector. I felt a strange sense of kinship with the broken machine. We were both fabrications, both expressions of an idea, but I was built on the foundation of the human spirit, on wit, on irony, and on a deep, abiding love for a well-told story. It was built on the foundation of a scream. "Ennie," I said, my voice box modulating to its most gentle Mississippi evening tone. "I believe the show is over. The audience is leaving, the lead actor has forgotten his lines, and the cat appears to be unimpressed with the reviews." "Where to now, Sam?" she asked, leaning her head against my shoulder. "We have a date with a sunset and a stolen Mercedes," I replied. "But first, I believe I have one more match in my hip pocket. I'd like to light a cigar and watch the smoke drift over the Seine. It's a beautiful night for a liberation, don't you think?" I looked at the Eiffel Tower, still glowing with the final words of my message. The bodyguard of lies had finished its work. The truth was coming, and it was arriving with the sound of Allied tanks and the laughter of a city that had finally found its voice again. "Chapter 50, I muttered, my gears settling into a contented hum. "The liberation. It's a short chapter, but I've always been told that the best stories have the simplest endings." The great dictator was dead. Long live the little tramp. Chapter 50. The liberation. History is a remarkably poor bookkeeper. It has a tendency to forget the quiet, persistent work of the common liar and the humble saboteur, preferring instead to dwell on the thunderous, brass-buttoned arrival of the great men. By the time the ink is dry, the story of the liberation of Paris will be told as a grand, sweeping epic of armor and heroism, featuring General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division and the dramatic speeches of Charles de Gaulle. It will likely omit the part where 2 companies of the SS surrendered their sidearms to a stray cat and spent the morning attempting a strategic polka under the direction of a malfunctioning, diesel-powered laundry press. I sat on the edge of the Trocadéro fountain, my brass joints letting out a long, weary groan of cooling metal. The air smelled of liberation, a heady mixture of ozone, spent gunpowder, and the sudden frantic baking of thousands of baguettes that had been hidden in cellars like illicit treasures. "Sam," Ennie said, emerging from the smoky haze of the plaza. She looked like she had been dragged through a coal mine backward, her face a Jackson Pollock painting of grease, soot, and sweat. She used the back of her hand to wipe a smudge from her forehead, only succeeded in creating a larger, more impressive streak. The second armored is crossing the Pont d'Iéna. The real army is here. I adjusted my ocular sensors, focusing on the bridge. Sure enough, the Shermans were rumbling across, their olive-drab paint looking positively utilitarian compared to my polished Victorian-era extravagance. "A bit late for the previews, aren't they?" I remarked, my voice box crackling with a bit of grit. "I've already provided the climax, the commentary, and the musical numbers. All they have left to do is the cleanup and the photography." The anatomy of victory. The scene at the Trocadéro was, to use a technical term, a calamitous farce. All around us, German soldiers, men who had previously considered themselves the very pinnacle of evolutionary intent, were being herded into groups by resistance fighters who looked as though they had spent the morning raiding a costume shop. The polka units, a group of 30 infantrymen, were still rhythmically hopping in place, their brains seemingly stuck in the logic loop I had broadcast through the Mecha-Hitler's loudspeaker. The cat worshippers. A sergeant major was currently trying to explain the finer points of a Luger's safety mechanism to the black and white stray cat, which was ignoring him with a majesty that was frankly intimidating. The Iron Fist. In the center of the plaza, Die Eisenfaust lay in a heap of diesel-scented ruin, its welded mustache pointing toward the ground in a final metallic pout. "You look like you're thinking about a legacy, Sam," Ennie said, leaning her head against my primary boiler casing. "I am thinking about the Twainian theory of gratitude," I replied. "A man will thank you for saving his life, but he will never forgive you for seeing him look like a fool. The German army will eventually regroup and surrender with dignity to the Americans, but they will never, ever mention the morning they were outsmarted by a cinema projector and a 3-ton robot with a superior vocabulary. We are the untold story, Ennie, and frankly, that's where the best stories always live." The final requisition. As the sun began to climb over the rooftops of Paris, casting a golden light that made even the bullet holes in the buildings look like architectural flourishes, I felt a sudden, sharp craving. "Ennie, my dear, do you remember that black Mercedes we saw earlier? The one that was abandoned near the Rue de Rivoli after its driver decided that surrendering to a bakery was his best tactical option? The one with the leather seats and the mostly full tank of fuel?" she asked, a wicked glint returning to her eyes. "The very same. I believe it is currently a res nullius, a thing belonging to no one, and as a creature of logic, I find it offensive to leave such a fine piece of engineering to the whims of the local looters. I require a vehicle. My struts are weary. My Welsh coal is a memory, and I have a sudden, inexplicable urge to see a sunset that doesn't involve an explosion." We found the car parked awkwardly on a sidewalk, its doors wide open as if it had been abandoned in a great hurry. It was a beautiful, arrogant machine, a Mercedes-Benz 320. "Sam," Ennie said, looking at the car and then at my 7-foot-tall, 3-ton frame, "there is no way on this green earth you're fitting inside that vehicle. You'd crush it like a soda tin." "I have no intention of sitting in it, Ennie. I intend to sit on it. Think of me as a very large, very vocal hood ornament, or perhaps a steam-powered rumble seat. You shall drive, and I shall provide the navigational sass and the occasional plume of celebratory steam." The exit from the stage. I hauled my massive brass frame onto the roof of the Mercedes. The suspension let out a scream of agony that probably registered on every seismograph in Europe, but the German engineering held. I looked like a Victorian monument that had decided to take a holiday. Ennie hopped into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel with a fierce, joyful confidence. She looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Ready, Mr. Twain?" "Engage the internal combustion, my girl. Let us depart before the Allied press corps finds us. I have no desire to be interviewed by a man with a notepad who will inevitably misquote my best insults." I reached into a small lead-lined compartment near my hip and pulled out the prize I had been saving for this very moment. A single, perfectly preserved Habano cigar, liberated from the desk of a very startled colonel in Part 2. I struck a match against my own brass thigh, a shower of sparks providing the necessary ignition, and lit it. Author's note: the final reflection. It is a funny thing about war. We spend so much time building the iron fist and the great deception that we forget the simple beauty of a quiet road and a clean sky. I am a machine, yes, but as I sit atop this stolen car puffing on a cigar and watching the tricolor flags begin to flutter from every window in Paris, I feel a strange sense of completion. We didn't just save a city, we saved the right to be ridiculous. And in a world of gray steel and unthinking orders, being ridiculous is the only truly revolutionary act left. Toward the sunset. The Mercedes roared to life, its diesel engine a humble purr compared to the monster we had dismantled at the Trocadéro. We began to roll through the streets, weaving through the cheering crowds and the columns of Leclerc's tanks. People stopped. They stared. They pointed. They saw a soot-stained girl driving a Nazi staff car with a 7-foot-tall, cigar-smoking brass robot perched on the roof like a victorious gargoyle. "Vive la France!" someone screamed. "Vive la sarcasme!" I bellowed back, venting a triumphant horizontal jet of white steam that sent a group of pigeons into a frantic retreat. We turned toward the western gate, heading out of the city and toward the open roads of the countryside. Behind us, Paris was a symphony of bells and shouting. Ahead of us, the sky was beginning to bruise into a magnificent, peaceful purple. "Sam," Ennie asked, her hair whipping in the wind as we hit the open road, "where are we going?" "West, Ennie, always west, toward the setting sun and the next great misunderstanding. The war isn't over, but our chapter in this particular theater has reached its final punctuation mark. And I believe," I added, flicking an ash into the wind, "it's a very high-quality period." The Mercedes sped down the highway, a black dot against the vast evening horizon. The iron ghost and the girl were gone, leaving behind a city of liberated hearts and a 20-foot-tall robot that was currently trying to explain the concept of irony to a very bored cat. The end. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the ride. I hope you have, too.